If The Black Phone feels inspired by Stephen King, it's because it was written by his son. Or his clone, I'm not sure. The Black Phone is the film that director Scott Derrickson left the Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness movie to helm, and this return to horror is a welcome improvement over the past few films he's directed. The last film he completed was 2016's Doctor Strange, a mid-tier Marvel Studio film that did have some creative visuals but didn't bear many of the characteristics of Derrickson's past with horror. I myself prefer the Sam Raimi zaniness of the sequel. Derrickson's directorial debut was the fifth Hellraiser movie, the first direct-to-video sequel for the franchise, and then he went on to direct The Exorcism of Emily Rose and Sinister. Sinister also starred Ethan Hawke, though he was the protagonist there, a troubled writer with a drinking problem who moves his family into a haunted house. Sounds like the plot to another horror movie I've seen. I just can't think of which one. Sinister just has too many horror tropes. Creaking floors, loud bangs, the lights shutting off, the ghost of a little girl going, shh. Long scenes of Ethan Hawke with either a flashlight or a baseball bat wandering around in the dark. This is why horror movies are cost effective. Think about how much screen time in Sinister is just a man walking around in the dark. Really helps out with the cost of lighting and set design. Derrickson's recent films have been middle of the road, and while The Black Phone's story is also heavy with tropes, it exceeded my expectations with the execution of its story. The Black Phone was written by Joe Hill, and it has some of the qualities of Stephen King's best-known work. Like Misery, the hero is trapped by a psycho who adores them. Like It, the kid gets bullied at school, so bullying plays into the themes behind the fear. The Black Phone takes place in the 70s, and it's just as much a nostalgic period piece as it is a horror film. There are references to the Partridge Family, Enter the Dragon, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. On the soundtrack, you're going to hear the Edgar Winter Group, Sweet, and Pink Floyd. It has a more personal and distinct feel than a generic horror movie like Sinister. When the film fully embraces the supernatural, it loses a little of my interest, even though it's the whole premise of the movie. I just would have preferred a more ambiguous approach to the supernatural element, one that could be interpreted multiple ways, but there's not really much left to debate. Finn can talk to dead people. They don't remember exactly who they are, so it's like the spirits are lingering in some form waiting to be freed. The only items in Finn's dirty basement cell are a mattress, a toilet, and an old black telephone hanging on the wall that the villain referred to as the Grabber says has been there since his childhood. He claims the phone no longer works, but the spirits of the kids say that he simply ignores it. The spirits of the other murdered kids call Finn on the phone and give him clues to help him escape, giving him information he wouldn't have known otherwise, like the fact that the unlocked door is a trap. I'd like to think that the spirit of the dead kids could be a metaphor, that Finn is figuring things out on his own and using the memory of people he knew, people who he respected and were protectors for him, to figure out how they would solve the puzzle of escaping the crazy man's basement. The fact that Finn's sister essentially has The Shining is an element of the movie I found unnecessary. There's a whole side story about Finn's sister Gwen, who is tougher than Finn. She's one of the many characters that has to save Finn from getting beaten up. Gwen has dreams where she sees the murder scenes of the victims, and the police are interrogating her for information. Would police really be asking a little girl about her dreams to solve the case of a serial murderer? The dream scenes are shot with a grainy, handheld quality, which is reminiscent of the film reels Ethan Hawke was investigating in Sinister. Other than these dream sequences, there's nothing too out of the ordinary about the way that The Black Phone is shot. Everything is a little too clean to feel hyper-real. It's a very nostalgic portrayal of the 70s. It's the 70s that people remember, not necessarily the 70s that was. Ethan Hawke is a reliable and passionate actor. He gave a nuanced performance in Sinister. The most interesting part of that film was that the protagonist had many negative qualities. He was a true crime writer who claimed to be interested in justice for the families of victims, but in reality only cared about clout and money. Ethan Hawke's performance was one of the better aspects of Sinister, and in The Black Phone he's a memorable villain. Subtext of abuse and trauma is inferred by his character, but the audience is mostly in the dark as to his exact past. He's a serial killer known as the Grabber who has been abducting children in the suburbs. The Grabber is portrayed as a disturbed and delusional monster who wears a frightening mask to keep his identity secret. He has several versions of this mask, one without a mouth and several smiling. That's the thing about a mask and why it's so scary is you can never tell the true intent of the person wearing it. He removes the top section of the mask when he's trying to appeal to his victims emotionally, but wears the full mask when he's preparing for violence. He engages in a ritual with the children he abducts where he leaves the door open for them to escape, but waits at the top of the stairs shirtless with a belt to punish them for trying to leave. He's clearly reenacting some childhood trauma from being abused, most likely by his father. Earlier in the film, we see Finn's father is an abusive alcoholic. In fact, the very first shot of the movie is a can of Coors being cracked open at a Little League game. The scene in which Finn's father beats his sister with a belt is horrifying because it's real-life trauma. It hasn't leapt into the supernatural yet. The different kids that Finn talks to over the phone each represent progress in Finn's growth. The first one, Bruce, is the kid that hit a home run when Finn was pitching, but was encouraging to Finn after the game. Next is the school's tough kid, Robin. Bruce and Robin, is that a subtle reference to Batman? Robin was Finn's protector at school, but disappeared, leaving Finn helpless. We know he's the cool kid because he's wearing a Cheech and Chong shirt and a headband. Then Finn talks to a paperboy, followed by a pinball wizard who looks like Roger Daltrey. Each ghost gives him a clue that will help him eventually escape. It was a little silly to me when you actually saw the ghosts of the kids in the room with Finn. The disembodied voice over the phone was creepy enough. The scene where Ghost Robin was giving him fighting lessons, yeah, it was just a little goofy. There were definitely moments that lightened the tone of this one when I would have preferred it to lean into the disturbing nature of the premise more. When Finn does escape the house, there's still another half hour of the movie left, so I knew he'd get captured again. It's not exactly the most unpredictable movie that you'll see this year. It leans into tropes, but tropes aren't necessarily a bad thing. There's a reason some story formats have existed for generations and get told over and over throughout different cultures. The Black Phone mashes up elements of ghost story, coming-of-age story, and serial killer investigation. The Black Phone seems to be based on John Wayne Gacy, as the Grabber has an unhealthy fascination with children.
I just wanted to look at you.
Abducting them from his black van complete with party balloons. As fast as you can say, "Are those black balloons?" Finn is stuffed into the back of a van and hauled off to a dingy basement to be the plaything of a sick freak in a Halloween mask. The Black Phone's themes about child abuse and mental health are what separates it from a cliched serial killer story. It's suggested that the Grabber is someone reenacting the trauma he experienced as a child. He's never shown to be possessed by a demonic entity or anything like that. I've liked horror movies that were based around serial killers, and I would watch a documentary about a serial killer, but I'm not very interested in serial killer biopics. First of all, biopics in general change historical events, leaving me to wonder why they didn't just make up a fictional character based on the real person and tell a similar story. Every time I watch a biopic, I feel obligated to do a bunch of research on the true story, so I don't walk around with some false narrative in my head about the life of a historical figure. Getting historical information from biopics is like getting your news off of Facebook. It's even more complicated when you're talking about murderers who contributed nothing to society, and it's debatable whether we should be focusing so much attention on them. Their actions need to be studied to understand mental illness, but they don't need to be glorified or romanticized. How many movies have been made about Jeffrey Dahmer, and every time they get some hot young actor to play him? Jeremy Renner, Lynch Ross, Evan Peters. It's mostly women who are into these movies so they can watch and say, how could someone so hot be so evil? Now I appreciate the Fritz Lang film M from 1930, where in the final act, Peter Lorre gives a monologue that makes the audience understand his character more, that he doesn't know why he kills but feels compelled to. But Peter Lorre is objectively hotter than Zac Efron or Evan Peters. The police come looking for the killer at the very house where Finn is being held, And the killer's brother is openly just doing cocaine, and they're like, okay, this place checks out, this guy's just on drugs, nothing wrong here. It felt a little unbelievable that the police wouldn't even search the place after finding drugs there. The brother character is played by the same actor who played the deputy in Sinister. He was sort of a comic relief character there as well.
I did see a small snake, though.
Snakes don't have feet.
Anyway, he gets his Scatman Crothers moment where he shows up to rescue the kid and takes an axe from behind. Another obvious Shining reference from the author. I don't think this movie really needed a comic relief side character like the brother. Though Sinister had a very disturbing ending, the ending to the Black Phone is an oddly optimistic one. The Black Phone ends with Finn killing the grabber by setting up a trap for him and then strangling him. He escapes and becomes the cool kid in school. It was a light-hearted ending for a movie about child murder. The girl in class calls him Finny, an infantilizing nickname he has been called throughout the film. And he's like, name's Finn. Wanna make out or something? It does neglect to deal with any lifelong trauma Finn will face after his friends were murdered and he was locked in a dirty basement by a psychopath who he had to kill in order to survive. This kid is going to need some therapy. He's not just going to show back up at school and be the cool kid now. This kind of feels like wish fulfillment from the writer. I understand the metaphor behind the horror. The kid who gets bullied and abused rises up to face his fears and assert himself in the world. It's a good coming-of-age story in that regard, but it would have been appropriate to include a suggestion that Finn is not as okay as he seems after such a devastating, life-changing series of events. For some reason, the Black Phone felt like a Japanese horror video game. Or maybe a point-and-click adventure where each ghost kid calling on the phone provides information on how to proceed. Maybe the combination of serial killers and the supernatural just makes me think of Persona 4. I'm going with a 7 out of 10 for the Black Phone. It's full of tropes, but I genuinely enjoyed it more than Sinister, which felt like a generic horror movie for a teenage audience. The Grabber is a much more serious villain than the Bagul, which was just the boogeyman. The Grabber is kind of a dumb name, though.